Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. My name is Sarah Finger. I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Alliance for Women's Health, and we are a proud member of the Better Choices Coalition. Today we're going to talk about how there are bad choices and better choices we can make in order to meet the needs of all Wisconsinites. We are not forced to make the bad choices that are presented to us in the governor's budget. We can and have the power and frankly the responsibility to make better budget choices. We have the money available to avoid making unnecessary cuts, and today we will demonstrate how we can actually help senior students, people with disabilities, and working families through better choices and not through the harmful budget that the governor has proposed. First, we have John Peacock with Wisconsin Council on Children and Families to provide a brief description of the Better Choices budget. Switch.
Thanks. Thank you, Sarah. Many state legislators, Republicans as well as Democrats, have said that the proposed cuts to the Wisconsin budget are much too deep and should be reversed. However, Republican leaders seem to be pinning all of their hopes on the possibility that state revenue estimates will increase significantly this week. We're very concerned that any increase in revenue projections that comes out this week won't be nearly enough to undo the severe damage caused by the deep cuts proposed by the governor in vital areas of the budget like K-12 and higher education, healthcare, and environmental protection. We're here today to make the simple but critically important point that legislators' hands aren't tied if there isn't a windfall of increased revenue. The deep cuts in critical areas of the budget can be avoided without any new tax revenue, and simply by freezing 2 tax breaks at their current level and by capturing Wisconsin's share of funding for Medicaid expansions. Last week, the Wisconsin Council on Children and Families began circulating a blueprint for an alternative budget plan, which we're calling the Better Choices budget. Thus far, 18 groups have endorsed that plan, which would generate more than $750 million by making 3 changes. First, saving $345 million by expanding Badger Care and bringing back to Wisconsin our state's fair share of funding that state taxpayers have been paying into the federal treasury for Medicaid expansions. Second, halting the continued phase-in of an ineffective corporate tax break that has mushroomed in cost. And third, reallocating $211 million that the governor's budget uses for poorly targeted property tax cuts that would ultimately provide little benefit to most homeowners. Our plan recommends using that funding to restore the $300 million cut from the University of Wisconsin, to provide $200 million more for public schools, and to eliminate the proposed cuts in healthcare services. We would also use a small amount for targeted tax relief, and we would add $50 million to the state's inadequate reserve funds. That leaves an additional $162 million to reduce a broad array of other damaging cuts in the proposed budget. I could explain our plan in greater detail, but those details can be found elsewhere on the WCCF website or Budget Project website and are almost besides the point. We're not wedded to the specific details of this plan. We're offering it primarily as an exercise in showing how state legislators could pass a much improved budget. Public polling shows broad support for undoing many of the cuts the governor proposed. The general public understands, and many legislators in both parties understand, that Wisconsin needs a budget that invests in the building blocks of a strong economy. The main thing standing in the way of a budget that avoids the damaging cut the governor has proposed is the notion that the only possible solution is a big increase in the revenue estimates. That's flatly incorrect. And our goal is to foster a much more robust debate about the budget by helping the general public know that there are relatively simple ways of avoiding the deep budget cuts without raising taxes or relying on sharply higher revenue estimates. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. We'll answer questions at the end for all our speakers today. Next, we have Susan Fox with the Monona Grove School Board. She's here to speak about how the governor's proposed budget harms public education and how better choices would protect our public schools. Susan.
The Wisconsin State Journal had it right in its headline of February 4, which read, "Walker goes on the offensive." Unfortunately, his proposed budget goes on the offensive against our public schools and thus attacks the heart of our communities. This budget does real harm to K-12 public education. At the same time, it reduces revenue available for public schools. It raises our costs with other provisions, thus adding to the financial challenges we face. Even the small increase proposed during the second year of the biennium only brings us back to the per pupil spending of 2010. And even from a distance, you can see this chart, what happened when Governor Walker came into office. This is per pupil aid over time, and this is the year 2011-12, and you can see what happened, the decrease. And it's, not bringing us back to what much less than we need. Wisconsin has suffered the second largest public school cuts in the nation. We need an increase in per pupil funding. Our legislators need to stop subsidizing private and for-profit schools and focus on investing in the public schools required by our state constitution. Section 3 of Article 10 of the state constitution requires the legislature to provide by law for the establishment of district schools, which shall be, and I'm quoting, "as nearly uniform as practicable." The increasing financial support of private schools and of independent charters, along with the reduction in state aid to public schools, calls into question whether the legislature is performing its constitutional duty. Minimally, the $150 per student categorical aid must be restored for 2015-16. For example, at Monona Grove, the elimination of these dollars amount to a loss of close to $440,000 for the next school year. Our projected enrollment indicates we need to hire an additional 8 teachers in order to maintain the class sizes that we've already increased to balance budgets in previous years. The loss of this aid means we won't be able to hire these teachers, which will result in further increasing class sizes or reducing possible other offerings to students. Per pupil reductions are hitting other districts even harder. Ultimately, our children need an increase in per pupil funding. An example of a proposal not directly related to revenue, but that increases cost to school districts, is the proposed elimination of local government property insurance fund, when you talk about other choices that could be made. Currently, we save just over $10,000 per year by participating in this fund, and will undoubtedly see our rates increase when this option is no longer available. We question the rationale for ending this program. It's likely that small rural districts already struggling will be even more affected by this common sense policy, which has held down costs for years. The new plan for funding voucher expansion outside of Milwaukee by taking the cost of these vouchers directly out of individual school district state aid, rather than funding this separately at the state level, is another blow. While some may argue that if some students leave a school, costs should go down, students generally do not leave at a rate that enables this to happen. For example, a school is unlikely to see an entire 4th grade class leave the school, enabling them to reduce staffing by 1 4th grade classroom teacher. Rather, students leave from varying grade levels in varying numbers, often with no impact to required staffing, while our funding goes down proportionally. Now, I'm not arguing that the state should appropriate more money for vouchers to avoid robbing individual school districts in this way. Rather, that state should not be expanding vouchers in the first place. We simply can't afford it either at the state level or at the district level. We also can't afford the expansion of independent charter schools. The proposed charter school oversight board that will have the authority to approve new independent charter schools removes local control and opens the door to for-profit schools, more privatization, and siphoning of resources from our traditional neighborhood schools. The failure to increase revenue limits means there is no real increase in aid to school districts in this budget proposal. According to the most recent Marquette University poll, and that was already alluded to, 54% of voters say that increasing school funding is more important than holding down property taxes. This makes this proposal even harder to understand. According to the same mid-April poll, 78% of voters oppose cutting the $150 per pupil aid from public schools. Public school districts around the state have used the so-called tools provided by Act 10 to try to contain costs. They've done their due diligence in balancing budgets while trying to provide varied programming, increase student achievement, and close the achievement gap. But some of us are at a breaking point. A budget increase of 0 is not flat, it is a budget cut. Our legislators need to make more responsible budget choices. Our public schools are the heart of our communities. Strong public schools are critical to our children's future and are key to economic recovery and a healthy middle class in Wisconsin. We need to invest our state's resources in the public education required by our state constitution and valued by our citizens. School boards should not have to budget by referendum because the state doesn't fulfill its obligations. We need an increase in per pupil funding, at least by the cost of living, so that school districts can actually keep up with costs. And we need to increase special education aid, which has fallen to approximately 26% of actual costs. Stopping the expansion of private school vouchers and independent charters will not cost the state a dime. Again, better choices. Tax subsidized vouchers in private schools take money directly away from our public schools. As the number of vouchers in private schools increase, resources for our public schools go down. Assurances by the governor and some legislators that they will make K-12 education a priority if we have more revenue than expected don't cut it. We have the money now. It's a matter of making the decisions that are right for our kids and families.
And then we have Bishop Mary Froylan, who will speak about how the governor's budget undermines our duty to society's most vulnerable and how Better Choices budget honors this commitment.
Good morning. She said I'm Mary Froylan and I'm the bishop.
That's
what, no. I'm the bishop of the South Central Synod of Wisconsin of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. You know, for thousands of years, people of faith have recognized the mandate of a compassionate society to care for, support, encourage, and provide for the most vulnerable among us. Unfortunately, there's no consensus on exactly how we are to do this, and disagreements most often today break down along partisan political lines. It's my hope and prayer that we can keep the end goal of a state that offers the opportunity for a healthy, fulfilling, quality life for all its citizens in front of us and work together to make that a reality. Governor Walker's proposed state budget makes drastic cuts to areas that contribute to this quality life: education, environmental protections, health care, care for those with disabilities, to name a few. The budget is presented from the perspective that cuts need to be made. There's not enough money to go around. Something has to give. Unfortunately, what has been offered up are basic safety net programs and education. The alternative budget, the Better Choices budget that we propose today, takes a different approach. Rather than looking at our state resources from a perspective of scarcity, we look from a perspective of abundance. We have enough. We can fund what we need to fund to assure the strength of our communities and our state. These two lenses through which we can view our situation, scarcity or abundance, have ramifications for how we live together. Believing there is never enough leads to anxiety, to a closing in on oneself, a tendency to hoard. Those who have little are pitted against those who have even less. Resentment, frustration, anger, and fear are fostered. On the other hand, viewing life from a perspective of abundance opens us up. Feeling financially secure fosters cooperation and generosity. Equitably sharing the responsibility for the support and improvement of our society as a whole creates opportunities. The gift of this alternative budget, this Better Choices budget, is that it discredits the myth of scarcity. This may not be the budget that's ultimately adopted, but it does show us that there are alternatives to Governor Walker's proposed budget with its drastic cuts to significant services. I hope we can work together to create strong communities and a strong state without further harming those who are the most vulnerable among us. Thank you.
And I'm going to wrap it up by talking about the Badger Care cuts and changes with Governor Walker's proposed budget. Wisconsin's Badger Care program provides quality, affordable health care coverage for more than 800,000 men, women, and children across the state. It was established in 1997 as a bipartisan effort to encourage work and improve healthcare in Wisconsin. BadgerCare is a successful, cost-effective program in both rural and urban communities. Currently, an adult without dependent children or a childless adult is eligible for BadgerCare if he or she earns an income at or below 100% of the federal poverty level. That equals approximately $11,770 a year, or $980 a month. The governor's budget proposes drastic changes to this program for childless adults that would significantly undermine the purpose of BadgerCare, which is to ensure that low-income people have access to the quality health care they need and deserve. Under Governor Walker's proposed budget changes to BadgerCare, it would require enrollees to pay monthly premiums as determined by the Department of Health and Human Services. It would also require a health risk assessment and impose higher premiums on enrollees who engage in behaviors that increase their health risks. It also limits eligibility to no more than 48 months. And finally, it requires a drug screening assessment and, if indicated, a drug test as a condition for eligibility. If enacted, these policies would undermine the governor's promise to ensure that there would be no health care coverage gaps in Wisconsin. We need, first and foremost, to make sure that we remove these damaging proposals in the budget, but more so, as indicated earlier by John, we also need to take advantage of the opportunity to expand and strengthen Medicaid in the state and bring much needed funding to the state. A recent Legislative Fiscal Bureau analysis projects that Wisconsin could save $345 million and cover an additional 81,000 Wisconsinites by expanding eligibility for BadgerCare to 138% of the federal poverty level. And this would be done again by accepting federal financing that would cover almost all of the cost of providing BadgerCare coverage to these childless adults. We have choices, as we've noted today. We have choices when it comes to BadgerCare. We have choices when it comes to some of the other programs, our public education, around tax cuts that have not worked to the degree that they have been promised. Today it's about, again, demonstrating an alternative, that there are better choices, that the governor's proposed budget is not the best route for Wisconsin. And again, we invite you to learn about the Better Choices budget. We have a link here that you can visit, and all of our organizations are available to talk about, again, the impact that the governor's proposed budget has on the families of the state and the opportunities we have to have a better budget and better choices. At this time, we can take any questions you might have about any of the speakers. Yes, Mike.
Sarah, why is it a problem to charge people on BadgerCare monthly premiums to pay for their health care?
For the individuals, again, that are making about $11,000, $700 a year, or $980 a month, any extra burden like that could often mean a major decision between food on the table or paying that extra premium, the transportation to get to jobs or educational opportunities. These are the people that already stretch extremely thin, and so by, again, shifting costs and making these individuals who are already struggling to get the health care they need and to balance the rest of their work and personal lives, that's just not something that is compassionate and the right thing to do for working families in the state.
John, will capping the tax credit for manufacturers take away jobs in Wisconsin?
I would say definitely not. That tax cut probably really ought to be eliminated. It was poorly designed in the first place because it's available for any corporations regardless of whether they're increasing the number of workers they have in Wisconsin or whether they're shipping their workforce overseas. If they have profits in Wisconsin, they get that credit, and it's gradually over the next couple of years going to entirely or almost entirely eliminate the corporate income tax for manufacturers. At the time that it was first enacted in a middle of the night amendment 4 years ago, it was expected to cost $129 million a year when fully phased in. It's now expected to cost more than twice that. It probably ought to be eliminated. We're proposing a compromise of freezing it at the current level. That would free up more than $200 million in the next biennium without hurting job creation.
Yes.
I'm trying to think how to make this a question, because what I really want to do is thank you for this excellent program that we read here. And on my way in, I was listening to the morning news, and it was mostly about what's happening in Baltimore. And they were explaining about how they've had to cut, over several years, have had to cut their civil budgets. And police were hard hit by that. And I think we are now seeing the price we pay when we don't have proper expenditures for local and state business. So I want to thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, if not, thanks.
Thank you
All
for
of
your
Thank you for
time.
coming.
Thanks.
Yeah.